Mary Johnson had never lived an easy life. At 48, she was a widow, raising 2 children on her own in a small, modest home in the outskirts of Atlanta. Her husband had passed away from a sudden illness nearly a decade ago, and ever since, Mary had carried the weight of both mother and father, provider and protector. She worked tirelessly, sometimes cleaning 3 houses a day, to make sure her children never went hungry. People often overlooked her. Employers saw only the uniform, not the woman wearing it. Neighbors whispered about her struggles, but rarely offered help. Mary had grown used to being invisible, to working in the background, unseen but indispensable. She bore it all with quiet strength and a gentle smile that masked her exhaustion. Everything changed when she was hired to work at the estate of Edward Whitmore, a wealthy, aging businessman who had made his fortune in international shipping and real estate. His mansion was enormous, cold, and intimidating, with white marble floors that echoed under every step and walls lined with expensive art. To Mary, it felt less like a home and more like a museum. Edward Whitmore himself was a man of contradictions. Tall but frail, with piercing blue eyes and silver hair, he carried an aura of authority that commanded respect. Staff whispered that he was harsh, impatient, and intolerant of mistakes. Many maids before Mary had quit within weeks. But Mary wasn't like the others. She approached her work with quiet dignity. She polished every corner, prepared meals with care, and always noticed the little things others overlooked. For instance, Edward's desk was always cluttered, but there was a small space near the window where sunlight poured in during the mornings. Mary began placing fresh flowers there, roses, tulips, sometimes wildflowers from her own garden. She never mentioned it, but she noticed, out of the corner of her eye, that Edward always paused at his desk a little longer on those mornings. At first, Edward barely acknowledged her. He ate in silence while Mary cleared the dishes, his eyes buried in the newspaper. But then came the winter evening that changed everything. Edward had insisted on working late in his study, despite his worsening health. Mary stayed behind, concerned, preparing him a bowl of soup. When she walked in, she found him slumped over his chair, gasping for breath. "Mr. Whitmore," she cried, rushing to his side. His face was pale, his hand trembling as he clutched his chest. Without hesitation, Mary grabbed the phone and called the doctor. She stayed with him through the night, holding his hand, whispering words of comfort until the crisis passed. The next morning, Edward looked at her differently. For the first time, his eyes softened. "You didn't have to stay," he said quietly. "I couldn't leave you like that, sir," Mary replied. "You're not alone." Those words struck him deeper than she knew. For years, Edward had lived surrounded by wealth, but deprived of genuine companionship. His relatives visited only when they wanted something. His business associates cared for his money, not his soul. But Mary, this woman who earned barely enough to survive, had stayed by his side when he was most vulnerable. From that day on, something shifted. Edward began to talk to her. At first, it was small comments, about the weather, about the food. But slowly, he opened up. He told her about his late wife, Eleanor, who had passed 20 years ago and left an emptiness in his heart that no amount of wealth could fill. He confessed his regrets, choosing business over family, chasing power while neglecting love. Mary, in turn, shared pieces of her own story. She spoke about her children, David, who dreamed of becoming a teacher, and Angela, who loved to sing. She told him about the struggles of raising them alone, about her faith that carried her through sleepless nights. Their conversations grew into companionship. Edward began asking her to sit with him during meals, something no staff member had ever done before. At first, Mary hesitated. Was it proper? But Edward insisted, and soon those meals became the highlight of both their days. Still, Edward's health declined with each passing year. He grew weaker, his steps slower, his voice softer. And yet, Mary's presence seemed to bring him a peace that medicine could not provide. She became more than his maid. She became his confidant, his friend, the only person who saw beyond the millionaire facade to the lonely man beneath. On one quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Edward looked at Mary with eyes filled with something she had never seen before: trust. "Mary," he said, his voice frail, "I don't have much time left, but I want to ask you something important. I have one last wish, and I need you to help me fulfill it." Mary's heart tightened. She leaned forward, holding his trembling hand. "What is it, Mr. Whitmore?" Edward's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I don't want my name remembered only for the fortune I made. I want it to mean something good. Will you promise me?" Tears welled up in Mary's eyes as she whispered, "I promise." And with that promise, her life, and Edward's legacy, was about to change forever. The days following Edward's request weighed heavily on Mary's heart. She did not yet know what his last wish truly was, but she could see the urgency in his eyes. He seemed determined to leave behind something more than wealth. Over the next few weeks, Edward began speaking more openly about his past. He shared stories of his childhood in Boston, of the nights when he and Eleanor had dreamed of traveling the world before business consumed his every waking hour. He spoke of his estranged brother, who had only ever reached out when money was involved, and of his distant cousins, who treated him more like a bank than a family member. "Money," Edward said one evening, "is a strange master, Mary. It gives you power but robs you of peace. Everyone wants it, yet no one truly loves the man who holds it." Mary listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She had no riches to her name, yet she understood more about love and loyalty than anyone Edward had ever known. His health declined rapidly that winter. His walks in the garden became shorter, his meals smaller. The once sharp voice that commanded boardrooms now trembled when he spoke. It was on a snowy December morning that Edward summoned his lawyer, Mr. Harrison, to the mansion. Mary was asked to sit in the room, though she hesitated at first. "Stay," Edward said gently. "This concerns you too." Mr. Harrison, a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses, opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Mr. Whitmore, are you certain about these changes?" Edward nodded slowly. "Yes. I've lived long enough to know what truly matters now. I want my last will to reflect that." Mary's heart raced as Edward continued. "I've already provided for my distant relatives more than they deserve. But there is one person who stood by me when no one else did. One person who gave me loyalty, kindness, and humanity when others gave me nothing but greed. That person is Mary Johnson." Mary gasped softly, her hand flying to her chest. "Mr. Whitmore, He raised a hand to silence her. "You stayed when I was sick. You gave me companionship when I had nothing but walls around me. Because of you, I remembered what it feels like to be human again. And so, I want you to be the one to fulfill my last wish." Tears blurred Mary's vision. "But sir, I'm just a maid. I don't deserve." "You deserve far more than you know," Edward said firmly. "You once told me I wasn't alone. I want to make sure you aren't either." The lawyer read aloud the revised will. To everyone's shock, Edward had left a significant portion of his estate under Mary's care, not for her alone, but to establish a foundation that would provide scholarships and housing for underprivileged families in the community. "Mary," Edward whispered, his eyes fixed on her, "I want you to oversee this. You know what it means to struggle. You'll know how to make this money truly matter. That is my last wish." Mary wept openly. "I'll do it, sir. I promise you I'll honor it." Edward's lips curved into a faint smile. "Then I can go in peace." A week later, Edward passed away quietly in his sleep. Mary was the one who found him, sitting in his chair by the window, sunlight pouring across his face as if heaven itself had welcomed him home. The news spread quickly, and soon, Edward's mansion was filled with distant relatives, all dressed in black, whispering among themselves about inheritances and fortunes. Mary stayed in the background, silent, her heart heavy with grief. She knew the storm was coming, and it came during the reading of the will. In the large, wood-paneled study, the lawyer stood before the gathered family. Edward's relatives leaned forward eagerly, expecting to hear of yachts, accounts, and properties being distributed among them. When Mr. Harrison announced that a major share of Edward's fortune was left under the stewardship of Mary Johnson, a maid, the room erupted. "This is absurd," shouted Richard, Edward's cousin. "She manipulated him in his weakness." "She's a nobody," cried another relative. "How can a servant be trusted with millions of dollars?" The accusations grew louder, filling the air with venom. Mary sat frozen, her hands trembling, tears brimming in her eyes. But Mr. Harrison raised his voice above the chaos. Mr. Whitmore made his decision clear. This was not an act of manipulation. He described Miss Johnson as the only person who gave him true loyalty in his final years, and he entrusted her with his last wish, to use these funds for the good of others. The family erupted again, threatening lawsuits, but the will was airtight. Edward had anticipated their greed and had written everything with meticulous detail. Mary, overwhelmed, could only whisper to herself, "I promised him. I'll do this, no matter what they say." That night, alone in her modest kitchen, she sat staring at the papers. She wasn't thinking of the money. She was thinking of Edward's faith in her. For the first time in her life, someone of great power and wealth had looked at her not as the help, but as a woman of worth. And now, she carried the weight of his legacy. Her journey was only beginning. The days after the reading of the will were some of the hardest Mary had ever faced. The Whitmore relatives were furious. Newspapers whispered of scandal. Maid inherits millionaire's fortune. Neighbors gossiped in hushed tones. Some accused her of trickery, others of witchcraft. But through the storm, Mary held firm. She remembered Edward's frail voice, the conviction in his eyes, and the weight of the promise she had made. "I'll honor it," she repeated to herself every morning, even when doubt clawed at her heart. Mr. Harrison, loyal to Edward's final wishes, became her closest ally. He guided her through the endless paperwork, the meetings with banks, and the foundations that would be set up. "You may feel unprepared," he told her, "but Mr. Whitmore chose you for a reason. Trust that." And so, the Whitmore Foundation for Hope was born. Mary began modestly. The first scholarships went to local students, young men and women who, like her in her youth, had been overlooked and underestimated. She visited schools personally, meeting with teachers and counselors, asking them to recommend children whose potential was buried under poverty. At the same time, the foundation purchased an abandoned building downtown and turned it into affordable housing for single mothers. Mary herself oversaw the renovations, walking the dusty halls in her plain shoes and apron, giving workers sandwiches she prepared in her own kitchen. "Ma'am," one of the builders once asked, wiping his brow, "why are you out here working like the rest of us? You're the boss now." Mary smiled softly. "I may have inherited responsibility, but I'll never stop serving. That's who I am." Word of her deeds began to spread. Local papers changed their tone, running headlines like, "From Maid to Miracle Worker," and "Whitmore's Last Wish Sparks Hope" in the community. Even those who once gossiped began to admire her. But the Whitmore relatives did not give up easily. They filed lawsuits, trying to prove Edward was not in his right mind. Courtrooms became battlefields. Lawyers shouted, accusations flew, and through it all, Mary sat quietly in her simple dress, hands folded, praying for strength. In the end, the court upheld Edward's will. His documents were thorough, his intentions clear. The relatives left in rage, their greed denied. Mary walked out of the courthouse with tears in her eyes, not of fear, but of relief. "Justice was on your side," Mr. Harrison told her, patting her shoulder. "No," Mary whispered. "Edward was on my side." Years passed, and the Whitmore Foundation grew. Hundreds of children graduated college with scholarships bearing Edward's name. Dozens of families moved into safe, affordable homes. Soup kitchens received funding, hospitals were supported, and forgotten neighborhoods bloomed with life again. And through it all, Mary remained the same humble woman. She refused luxury. She still lived in her modest home, still cooked her own meals, and still visited the mansion, Edward's old house, now turned into a community library and learning center. On the 10th anniversary of Edward's passing, the foundation held a ceremony in the garden of the mansion. Students, families, and neighbors gathered to honor the man whose wealth had been transformed into hope. At the center stood Mary, now older, her hair silvered but her spirit bright. A young woman approached her on stage. She was the first ever recipient of the Whitmore Scholarship and had just completed her medical degree. Tears filled her eyes as she hugged Mary. "Because of you," she whispered, "I'm a doctor today. You changed my life." Mary's eyes filled too, but she shook her head gently. "No, child. It was Edward's gift. I only carried it." The crowd erupted in applause. And for the first time, Mary felt the full weight of what Edward had entrusted her with. Not just money, but the chance to change lives, to heal wounds, and to prove that compassion is greater than greed. That night, as the celebration ended and the crowd dispersed, Mary sat alone in the garden where Edward used to walk. The roses were blooming, the stars bright above. She closed her eyes and whispered into the quiet air, "I kept my promise. You are not forgotten." And in her heart, she felt his presence, grateful, peaceful, and proud. The legacy of Edward Whitmore did not end with his death. It lived on through Mary Johnson, the humble maid who became the guardian of hope. And for generations to come, thousands would tell the story of how a millionaire's last wish was fulfilled not by power or family, but by the loyalty of a woman who once believed she was nobody, yet became the heartbeat of his legacy.